The pharmacist didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the prescription in her hand, then looked at me, then back at the paper. Her mouth opened slightly, like she was about to say something, then closed again. I remember thinking she looked like someone who had just read a word they didn't recognize and were trying very hard not to show it. "Is this for you?" she asked. "No," I said. "For my husband." She nodded slowly, asked me to wait a moment, disappeared behind the counter. I stood there by the pickup window, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, half distracted, scrolling through my grocery list on my phone. We needed eggs. I kept forgetting eggs. My husband had texted me twice that week about the eggs. She came back with a different woman, older, who introduced herself as the pharmacist on duty. The first woman, the technician, quietly moved away. The pharmacist asked if I had a few minutes. She said it in that particular tone BB use when they mean, "You need to make time for this." I put my phone in my pocket. She walked me to a small consultation area, just a little alcove with a low partition around it, barely any privacy at all. But she spoke in a voice low enough that it didn't matter. She told me she had a question about the prescription. She told me she wasn't trying to alarm me. Then she asked how long my husband had been taking this medication. I said I didn't know exactly. He'd mentioned something about a new prescription a few months back. Said it was for inflammation. He'd been having joint pain, he told me. I hadn't thought much about it. He was 41. Things start to hurt when you're in your 40s. That's just life. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This prescription," she said carefully, "is not for inflammation." I didn't understand what she meant. I asked her what it was for. She told me, and I just stood there in that little alcove with people walking past behind me choosing between brands of shampoo, and I felt the floor go very solid and certain beneath my feet while everything else went completely sideways. My name is Joelle. I was 32 when this happened. I had been married for 6 years to a man I met when I was 25 and thought I had understood completely. We lived in Columbus, Ohio, in a house we'd bought together 3 years into the marriage, a beige craftsman with a porch neither of us ever used and a kitchen that got good afternoon light. I worked as a physical therapist at an outpatient clinic. He worked in sales, medical devices, traveled sometimes for work, but not excessively. We had a dog, a 7-year-old rescue mutt named Fig. We had a joint checking account and separate savings. We had a routine. That is the part that still gets me sometimes, when I let myself think about it. We had a routine. I knew what brand of cereal he liked. I knew which side of the sink he used. I knew he could not sleep without a fan running, even in January. I thought I knew everything about him. I knew almost nothing. It had started, though I didn't understand at the time that anything had started, about 8 months before the pharmacist pulled me aside. I'd begun feeling tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Not dramatic exhaustion, nothing I could point to and say this is wrong. Just a low persistent depletion, like I was always running about 15% below where I should be. I mentioned it to my doctor at my annual physical. She ordered blood work. Everything came back normal, she said. Probably stress. I was a physical therapist. I was on my feet all day. I worked with patients in pain. I carried a lot of other people's discomfort home with me. Stress made sense. I accepted it. But then came the headaches, dull, constant, sitting right behind my eyes, and the joint stiffness in the mornings. Ironic, given my job, that took longer and longer to shake off. And a kind of cognitive fog, small but noticeable. The sensation of reaching for a word and finding nothing there. I went back to my doctor. More blood work. A referral to a neurologist. The neurologist found nothing alarming. Recommended I see a rheumatologist. The rheumatologist ordered her own tests. Everyone was thorough and unhurried and ultimately a little puzzled. In the meantime, my husband was attentive, solicitous even. He made sure I was eating, asked how I was feeling, brought me tea in the evenings when I was tired. He mentioned a few times that I seemed to be pushing myself too hard at work. He suggested, gently, that maybe I should reduce my hours. I remember thinking how lucky I was that he noticed, that he cared enough to worry. The morning I went to pick up his prescription, I was not suspicious of anything. He'd asked me to grab it on my way home from work, said he'd gotten a new prescription from his doctor and hadn't had time to pick it up himself. That was not unusual. We ran errands for each other regularly. It was a normal thing. I handed the pharmacist his information. She pulled it up. Then the pause. Then the other woman. What the pharmacist told me in that careful, quiet voice in the consultation alcove was that the medication on the prescription was not used for inflammation. It was used, one of its documented uses, to treat a specific type of heavy metal toxicity. She said she was mentioning it because the prescription had been filled twice before at a different location, and because the dosage was unusual. High, she said. Higher than typical therapeutic use. She said she was not in a position to tell me what it meant, but she looked at me in a way that said something. She asked if I was doing okay. I said I was fine. I drove to the parking lot. I sat in my car for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock change and kept thinking I should leave. I should leave, and I didn't leave. Then I drove to the urgent care clinic 3 miles away, walked in, and told them I needed a heavy metal panel. They asked if I had a referral. I said no. They told me it would be out of pocket. I said I understood. I gave them my arm. There are moments in your life when you know, before you know. I knew in that parking lot. I didn't have the blood work results yet, didn't have confirmation of anything, couldn't have told you exactly what I was afraid of. But some part of me had already assembled the pieces, the fatigue, the headaches, the brain fog, the months of specialists who found nothing obviously wrong, and had come to a conclusion that the rest of me was not ready to accept. I drove home. I made dinner. I smiled when he asked how my day was. I did not tell him I'd had blood drawn. The results came back in 4 days. My levels of thallium were elevated. Not dramatically. Not at a level that would have sent me to an emergency room, but elevated beyond what any normal environmental exposure could explain. Thallium is a heavy metal. It used to be used in rat poison before they banned it in the US. In small amounts over time, it causes fatigue, neurological symptoms, hair thinning, joint pain. It is apparently very difficult to detect without specifically testing for it. The medication on his prescription was Prussian blue, one of the only treatments for thallium poisoning. I sat with that information for a long time. I sat with what it meant that he had a prescription for the antidote, that he had been filling it somewhere else at a different pharmacy, that the timeline of his joint pain, the reason he'd given me, lined up almost perfectly with the timeline of my symptoms beginning. I sat with the question of whether I was being insane, whether there was an explanation I wasn't seeing, whether I was about to blow up my entire marriage on a coincidence and some elevated lab numbers. Then I thought about the tea he brought me every evening. I thought about the smoothies he made on weekends, always with a particular mix of powders and supplements, always handing me mine first with a smile. I thought about the fact that he had specifically, in the past 6 months, begun doing most of the grocery shopping himself, that he'd started making most of the meals, that he had in gentle incremental ways made himself the person responsible for what I consumed. I stopped drinking the tea. I poured the smoothies down the sink when he wasn't looking and washed the glass so he wouldn't notice. I kept smiling. I want to be honest about something because I think people who hear stories like this always imagine that the person being deceived must have missed something obvious, must have been naive, must have had doubts they ignored. And maybe there were signs I explained away. But I also want to say that he was not a monster in every moment. He was often warm. He laughed at my jokes. He was pleasant in many of the ways that matter. That is a thing that took the longest to understand, that someone can be kind to you in 100 ordinary ways while doing something terrible in one hidden way. And the kindness is not a disguise exactly. It is just also true. It just coexists with the other thing. And that coexistence is what makes it so hard to see. I didn't stop loving him immediately. I stopped trusting him. Those are different processes and they don't happen at the same speed. I called a lawyer before I called anyone else. Her name was Audrey. I'd found her through a referral from a colleague who'd been through a divorce a few years earlier. I met her at her office downtown on a Tuesday afternoon and told her everything: the pharmacist, the blood work, the prescription, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not move out, do not confront him, and do not tell him anything has changed." "Can you do that?" I said I thought I could. She said she was going to put me in touch with a private investigator. She said she was going to put me in touch with a private investigator. She said we needed documentation. She said that elevated lab results and a prescription could be explained away by a clever defense attorney. What we needed was evidence of purchase, evidence of access, evidence of pattern. She also said something else, something I've thought about many times since. She said, "People do this for different reasons. Sometimes it's insurance money, sometimes it's a third party, sometimes it's something more complicated. What you need to figure out eventually is whether you want to understand why or whether you just want to be safe. Those are different goals and they require different decisions." I told her I wanted both. She smiled a little sadly. "They usually do," she said. The next several weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work, I came home. I had dinner with my husband. I asked him about his day. I laughed when things were funny. I was, I believe, a very good actress, though I had no prior experience with the role. What I was doing underneath the performance, taking photographs, documenting, keeping a private journal on a device he didn't know I had, a cheap prepaid phone I kept in my gym locker at work, writing down dates, observations, things he said. I'd started keeping receipts for things I purchased myself, groceries I bought separately and kept in my car, meals I ate at work, foods I knew he had not prepared. The private investigator, a quiet woman named Laurel who seemed allergic to drama, which I appreciated, found within 3 weeks that my husband had made several cash purchases at a chemical supply company over the past year. She found that he had a separate email account I hadn't known about. She found through that account correspondence with a woman he'd been seeing for at least 2 years. She also found something else. He had, approximately 14 months prior, increased the life insurance policy on me significantly. When Audrey told me this over the phone, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage at work. I remember looking at my hands on the steering wheel and thinking, there it is. Not surprise, not even devastation quite. Something quieter than that. A door closing on a room I had not known I was standing in. There is a question people always ask when they hear the story, or at least the question I always imagine them asking, which is, how are you still so calm about it? And the honest answer is that I don't know if calm is the right word. What happened was that at some point, somewhere in those weeks of documentation and performance and driving to work with food I had bought myself because I did not trust what was in my refrigerator, I made a decision. I decided that falling apart was something I could do later. That what I needed to do right now, in this window, was think. Clearly and practically and without the noise of emotion getting in the way. I had grown up with a mother who did not have her own money, who could not leave when she needed to because she had no account he didn't know about, no credit in her own name, no plan. I had watched that and promised myself young that it would not be me. I had a savings account he didn't touch, not much, a few $1,000s, but enough to act. I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters. Financial independence is not a cynical thing. It is not evidence of distrust or a lack of commitment. It is the thing that lets you leave when leaving becomes necessary. It is the thing that gives you choices when someone has decided you should not have any. Because of those few $1,000s, I could pay Audrey. I could pay Audrey. I could think about the next step without the next step being determined by someone else's willingness to fund it. On a Thursday evening in April, while my husband was at what he claimed was a work dinner, I left, not dramatically, not with shouting or confrontation or any of the things I had sometimes imagined in darker moments. I simply packed 2 bags. I had a list, had thought it through carefully, had discussed with Audrey exactly what to take and what to leave, and I drove to my friend Cassie's apartment across town, where I had already arranged to stay. Cassie did not ask many questions. She made me a cup of actual, verifiably safe tea and sat with me while I didn't say much of anything for a while. She's the kind of friend who understands that sometimes presence is the thing you need more than conversation. The next morning, the police made contact with my husband. I was not there for it. I had given everything: the lab results, the documentation, Laurel's findings, the insurance policy change, to the detective Audrey had connected me with. A woman named Petra. She was thorough and she was not theatrical about it, and I trusted her. I don't know exactly how the conversation went. I only know how it ended. There is a part of this I have not figured out how to talk about in a clean, resolved way, so I'm just going to say it plainly. He told the detective eventually that he had not meant for the amounts to be what they were, that he had not understood the accumulation, that he had been in a bad place, that he was sorry. I do not know what to do with the fact that I believed for a moment that he was sorry. Not because it changed anything, it didn't and shouldn't, but because I had known him for 9 years, had loved him genuinely, and some part of me wanted there to be an explanation that made the world make sense again. An explanation that let me understand how a person I knew could have done this. There is no such explanation. I've had to accept that. He was charged with aggravated assault and criminal poisoning. He pled guilty, which meant no trial, which was a mercy I had not expected. He was sentenced to 18 years. His attorney argued for less. The judge looked at the insurance policy documentation and the length of time the exposure had continued, and she was not moved. I moved to Portland about 4 months after the sentencing. Not for any dramatic reason. A position opened at a clinic there, one I'd applied to on a bit of an impulse, and they offered it to me, and I thought, why not? Columbus was not a bad city. It had just become a city full of before, and I needed somewhere that was only after. I live alone now. Fig moved with me. He adapted faster than I did, found his favorite window within a week, settled in like he had never lived anywhere else. Dogs have a practicality about them that I find very comforting. My thallium levels are back to normal. My energy is back. The headaches are gone, the brain fog is gone, the joint stiffness that I had started to think of as just getting older is gone. My body, it turns out, was working correctly all along. It was just being interrupted. I see a therapist every 2 weeks. We talk about trust, mostly what it feels like to rebuild it, not just of other people but of my own perceptions, my own instincts. Because one of the longest lasting effects of something like this is not the physical symptoms. It's the question of whether you can believe yourself, whether your read of a situation, of a person, of a moment is real. I'm learning to trust that what I see is what's there. It is slow work. But I am in no hurry. I think about the pharmacist sometimes. I don't know her name. I never asked in the shock of that moment. I've gone back to that Walgreens twice, hoping to recognize her, but I haven't. I don't know if she thinks about it. That afternoon, the woman she pulled aside over an unusual prescription. I don't know if she knows what she did, but she looked at me in a way that asked if I was okay, when I was clearly not okay, when the specific reason I was not okay was sitting right in front of her in the form of a prescription she was holding. And that small act of looking, of choosing to say something rather than nothing, is the reason I'm here. Sitting in my apartment in Portland with Fig snoring on the couch, writing this out, alive and well and embarrassingly grateful for ordinary things. Someone saw me when I couldn't see what was happening to myself. I think that's worth saying, even if she never knows I said it. People ask me sometimes what I would tell someone who is where I was, and I always want to give a useful answer, something practical. But the truth is the most useful thing I can say is also the simplest. If something is wrong with your body and no one can explain why, keep asking, keep testing. Do not let yourself be told that the answer is probably just stress, not because doctors are wrong, but because you know your own body better than a chart does. The difference between how I felt for 8 months and how I feel now is the difference between 2 blood tests, one that looked for the usual things and found nothing, and one that looked for the unusual thing and found everything. And if you are afraid to leave, afraid because of money, or logistics, or because you still love someone who has hurt you, or because you don't trust yourself, or because starting over at 32 or 40 or 55 feels like standing at the edge of something with no bottom, I want to tell you that the other side exists. I know because I'm standing on it. It doesn't look like what I thought it would. It's quieter, less triumphant, more ordinary. But ordinary, I have come to understand, is not a consolation prize. Ordinary is the whole point. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect, not in a mystical way. I don't believe the universe was sending me signals or that anything was fated. I believe in something simpler and I think more honest, that choices accumulate, that what a person does in private consistently over time eventually becomes visible. It has to. The math doesn't work any other way. My husband made choices, small ones at first, probably, the kind that feel reversible, that you can still tell yourself you haven't fully committed to. And then larger ones. And then ones there was no walking back from. He chose to research something he should never have researched. He chose to purchase it. He chose to put it in food, prepared with his own hands, for someone who trusted him completely. He chose to do it again and again, for months. Each choice reinforcing the next one, building a structure that could only end one way. What I've come to understand is that cruelty on that scale doesn't happen in a single moment. It's constructed slowly out of smaller decisions that each feel manageable to the person making them. That's the part that stays with me. Not the horror of the act itself, but the patience of it, the deliberateness. And here is the other side of that same logic. My survival was also constructed, slowly, out of smaller decisions. The decision, years before any of this, to keep money in my own name. The decision in that pharmacy parking lot, to sit with what I'd just learned instead of explaining it away. The decision to get the blood test before I had any confirmation that I needed one. The decision to call Audrey before I called anyone else. Each of those choices, stacked on top of one another, built something that held. I think about Audrey asking me whether I wanted to understand why, or whether I just wanted to be safe. I said I wanted both. But the truth is, in the time since, I've made peace with the fact that I may never fully understand why. Some people will tell you that understanding is necessary for healing, that you have to know the reasons before you can move forward. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. What I needed was not an explanation. What I needed was out. And then, once I was out, I needed to rebuild my trust in my own perception, which is slower, harder work than any single revelation. The intelligence I'm most grateful for is not the intelligence that figured out what was happening to me. It's the intelligence that knew to stay quiet long enough to get documentation, that knew to talk to a lawyer before confronting anyone, that knew the difference between acting out of emotion and acting out of strategy, and chose strategy even when every part of me wanted to do something else. Courage, I've learned, is not the absence of fear. It's continuing to make clear-eyed decisions while afraid. I was afraid every single day of those weeks. I was afraid at dinner, across the table from someone I had loved for 9 years. I was afraid in the parking garage when Audrey called me about the insurance policy. I was afraid on the drive to Cassie's apartment, bags in the back seat, Fig in the passenger seat, looking at me with that dog expression that means nothing and somehow means everything. I was afraid, and I kept going anyway. That is the only version of courage I know how to describe from the inside. If you take anything from what I've shared, I hope it's this. Trust the thing in you that says something is wrong, even before you have proof. That feeling is not weakness. That feeling is intelligence operating below the level of words. It was right about my own body before any lab result confirmed it. It was right about my marriage before I was ready to say it out loud. Your instincts are not your enemy. Listen to them. Then act.